Gretchen was busy in the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune as she stirred the pot of marinated chicken. She loved preparing this dish. It was her boss's favorite, and she took pride in getting the flavors just right. The aroma of soy sauce, garlic, and spices filled the air, making the kitchen feel warm and inviting. Suddenly, the kitchen door burst open, and a loud voice shattered her peaceful moment. "Gretchen!" Aldrin shouted, making her jump and nearly drop the ladle she was holding. "Are you crazy? Why are you yelling like that?" Gretchen snapped, glaring at him as she steadied herself. Aldrin ignored her outburst, panting slightly from his rush. "Sir is outside. And guess what? He brought his girlfriend." Gretchen's eyes widened in surprise. "What? But they weren't supposed to come back until lunchtime." "I don't know, but they're already in the garage," Aldrin replied, leaning against the doorframe. She wiped her hands on her apron, her brow furrowed. "Did you see what his girlfriend looks like?" Aldrin shook his head. "No, I only saw her from the back, but she was clinging to Sir like glue." With a sigh, Gretchen finished cooking and quickly tidied herself up. "All right, let's go see what all the fuss is about." The two of them headed to the living room. As soon as Gretchen stepped in, her eyes landed on their boss, seated casually on the sofa. Next to him was a woman wearing oversized sunglasses, the kind you'd wear at the beach. Gretchen's brows instinctively rose. "Gretchen, Aldrin, meet my girlfriend, Zarah," their boss said, gesturing toward the woman beside him. "She'll be staying here until her condo is fixed." Gretchen forced a polite smile. "Gretchen Purr," she said, introducing herself. Zarah removed her sunglasses with a dramatic flair, revealing a face heavily coated in foundation. Gretchen tried to hide her reaction but couldn't stop her brow from twitching. "Can I go to my room now, hon?" Zarah said, ignoring the introductions entirely and addressing their boss. Her tone was sweet but carried an air of entitlement. "Go ahead," their boss replied. "Gretchen," he called, turning to her. "Sir, is Zarah's room ready?" Gretchen raised an eyebrow. "Why are you asking me? Shouldn't you ask the housekeeping staff? I'm assigned to the kitchen." Aldrin nudged her sharply in the side. "Don't talk like that. You might get in trouble." Gretchen huffed but didn't back down. "Why would I get in trouble? It's not my responsibility to clean the rooms," she muttered under her breath. Zarah, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Even if it's not your job, you should still know. You're just a maid, after all." Gretchen's eyes narrowed. She crossed her arms, her tone sharp as she replied, "Excuse me? You're not the boss here, so don't act like it. Unless you're the one paying my salary, you have no right to talk to me like that." Zarah's mouth fell open in shock, clearly not expecting such a bold response. "And one more thing," Gretchen added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I wasn't even talking to you, so maybe next time, learn some manners before butting in." Satisfied, Gretchen turned on her heel and marched back to the kitchen. As she entered, she muttered to herself, "Shameless. Acting like royalty when her face looks like it's been dipped in flour. And my boss, ugh, his taste is just awful." What Gretchen didn't realize was that her boss had followed her into the kitchen and had heard every single word. "What did you just say?" The deep baritone voice made Gretchen jump. She spun around, her heart pounding as she faced her boss, who was leaning casually against the doorframe. His dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "Oh, sir," Gretchen said with a nervous laugh, trying to play it cool. "I didn't see you there." "I asked you a question, Gretchen," he said, stepping closer. "Did you just insult my girlfriend? And me, for that matter?" Gretchen hesitated for a moment, but decided to stand her ground. "Well, sir, yes. I said it." His brows furrowed as he closed the distance between them, his presence almost overwhelming. Gretchen found herself backing up until she was pinned against the counter. "You've got a sharp tongue, Gretchen," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you've got bad taste in women," she shot back, her defiance masking the nervous flutter in her chest. Before he could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Aldrin peeked in, clearly sensing the tension. Sir? Lunch is ready." Her boss straightened, his dark gaze lingering on Gretchen for a moment before he turned and left the kitchen. Gretchen let out a shaky breath, clutching the edge of the counter for support. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Gretchen couldn't shake the memory of her boss's intense stare. She busied herself with her kitchen duties, trying to ignore the way her heart raced whenever she thought about him. Meanwhile, Zarah seemed to take every opportunity to assert her presence. She flitted around the house, giving unnecessary orders to the staff and tossing condescending remarks at Gretchen whenever they crossed paths. But Gretchen wasn't one to back down. During dinner, Zarah complained about the food being too salty. Gretchen, standing just within earshot, raised an eyebrow. "Maybe the food isn't the problem. Perhaps it's your taste buds," she said sweetly, earning a laugh from Aldrin and a glare from Zarah. Their boss, seated at the head of the table, watched the exchange silently, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. Gretchen's feisty personality was starting to amuse him, though he'd never admit it out loud. As the evening wore on, Gretchen found herself in the kitchen once again, cleaning up after dinner. She didn't notice her boss enter until he was standing right behind her. "Gretchen," he said softly, making her jump for the second time that day. "Sir, do you enjoy sneaking up on people?" she asked, turning to face him. He smirked. "You're entertaining to watch. I never know what's going to come out of your mouth next." "Well, sir, if you keep eavesdropping, you're bound to hear more," she replied cheekily. His smirk deepened, and for a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent challenge. Gretchen didn't know what to make of the strange warmth in his gaze, but she quickly brushed it off, turning back to her work. She didn't have time for silly distractions, not when there was a house to run and a certain flower-faced woman to deal with. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of the chaos and sparks that would define her relationship with her boss. Gretchen was at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables when Aldrin walked in, his expression grim. "What's with the face?" she asked, not bothering to look up. "Zarah," he muttered, slumping onto a nearby stool. "She's at it again." Gretchen stopped mid-chop and turned to face him. What did she do this time? "She's redecorating the living room," Aldrin replied, throwing his hands in the air. "Apparently, the vibe isn't to her liking. She made Sir call in an interior designer to change everything." Gretchen groaned. "Unbelievable. She's been here for less than a week, and she's already acting like she owns the place." Aldrin chuckled. "At least you're not the one carrying all the heavy furniture." "That's because I'm smart enough to stay out of her way," Gretchen said with a smirk. "Unlike you, who somehow always ends up her errand boy." "Not by choice," Aldrin muttered. Before Gretchen could respond, Zarah's voice echoed from the hallway. "Gretchen, Aldrin, come here." They exchanged a look of exasperation before heading to the living room. The sight that greeted them was almost comical. Zarah stood in the middle of the room, hands on her hips, surrounded by chaos. Furniture was scattered everywhere, and rolls of fabric were draped across the sofas. "Do you need something, ma'am?" Gretchen asked, keeping her tone as neutral as possible. "Yes," Zarah said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I need you to move that chair over there." She pointed to a large armchair on the far side of the room. Gretchen raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the mover's job?" Zarah's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning me?" "Not at all," Gretchen replied with a forced smile. "But I do think you'd get better results if you hired professionals for this." Zarah let out an annoyed huff but didn't press the issue. Instead, she turned to Aldrin. "And you, bring me a glass of water. Room temperature, no ice." Aldrin shot Gretchen a pleading look, and she bit back a laugh. "Good luck," she whispered as he reluctantly headed to the kitchen. The next morning, Gretchen was busy watering the plants in the garden when Zarah appeared, dressed in an outfit that was far too extravagant for a casual morning. "What are you doing?" Zarah asked, her tone accusatory. Gretchen glanced at her, watering the plants. Zarah frowned. You're doing it wrong. Oh, really? Gretchen said, crossing her arms. Please, enlighten me. Zarah rolled her eyes and snatched the watering can from Gretchen's hands. You need to sprinkle the water lightly, like this. She demonstrated with exaggerated movements. Gretchen watched in silence, her lips twitching with suppressed laughter. Zarah was holding the watering can upside down, and the water was pouring out in a stream, drenching the flowers. Wow, you're a natural, Gretchen said dryly. Zarah turned to glare at her. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, Gretchen replied innocently. Just that the flowers seem to love your technique. Before Zarah could respond, their boss stepped out onto the patio. What's going on here? He asked, his gaze shifting between the two women. Gretchen doesn't know how to water plants, Zarah said, crossing her arms. Gretchen couldn't hold back her laughter any longer. Says the woman who just drowned half the garden. Their boss raised an eyebrow. Zarah, maybe you should leave the gardening to Gretchen. She's been taking care of these plants for years. Zarah opened her mouth to argue, but thought better of it. With a huff, she stormed back into the house, leaving Gretchen and her boss alone. Thanks for the backup, sir, Gretchen said with a grin. He smirked. Don't let it go to your head. That evening, Gretchen was in the kitchen preparing dinner when her boss walked in. Do you need something, sir? She asked without looking up. I wanted to talk to you, he said, leaning against the counter. Gretchen paused and turned to face him. About what? Zarah, he said, his tone serious. She told me you've been disrespectful to her. Gretchen's eyes widened. Disrespectful? Sir, all I did was suggest she let the movers handle the furniture. And what about the garden? He asked, raising an eyebrow. That was her fault. Gretchen protested. She took the watering can and... Her boss held up a hand, cutting her off. Relax, Gretchen. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just wanted to hear your side of the story. Gretchen crossed her arms. Well, my side is that she's been bossing everyone around like she owns the place. And honestly, sir, she's kind of unbearable. He chuckled. I've noticed. Gretchen blinked in surprise. You have? Yes, he said with a small smile. But she's still my girlfriend, so try to be patient with her. Gretchen sighed. I'll try, sir, but no promises. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at her. By the way, dinner smells amazing. Gretchen felt a small flush of pride at his compliment. Thank you, sir. As he left, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her boss than she'd initially thought. Despite his stoic exterior, there were moments, like tonight, when he seemed almost human. Little did she know, those moments were just the beginning of something much bigger. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Gretchen hummed softly, preparing her boss's favorite breakfast: fluffy scrambled eggs, garlic rice, and fried bangus. She was halfway through plating the food when Zarah's high-pitched voice pierced the quiet. Gretchen! Gretchen winced, setting the plate down and taking a deep breath before turning toward the source of her irritation. Zarah appeared in the doorway, looking annoyed despite her perfectly styled hair and makeup. Yes, ma'am, Gretchen replied, forcing a smile. I specifically told Aldrin that I wanted a smoothie for breakfast. Where is it? Zarah snapped, crossing her arms. Gretchen raised an eyebrow. Aldrin's not the cook, ma'am. Did you want me to make one for you? Yes, Zarah said, rolling her eyes. Do I have to spell it out for you? Honestly, it's like you don't understand basic instructions. Gretchen gritted her teeth, biting back a retort. What kind of smoothie would you like? Avocado, Zarah said, inspecting her nails. We don't have avocados right now, ma'am. Would mango or banana work instead? Gretchen asked as politely as she could manage. Zarah let out an exaggerated sigh. Ugh, fine. Mango, but make it quick. As Gretchen prepared the smoothie, Aldrin peeked into the kitchen, his expression amused. Another Zarah emergency? Gretchen smirked. She's just mad because the world doesn't revolve around her. Careful, she might hear you, Aldrin whispered, his eyes twinkling with mischief. I don't care, Gretchen said, pouring the smoothie into a glass. She needs to learn some manners. If she keeps acting like this, I might just accidentally spill something on her designer dress. Aldrin laughed. You wouldn't dare. Gretchen grinned. Try me. Later that day, the household was in chaos as preparations for an important dinner party were underway. Zarah had insisted on hosting the event to showcase her class and sophistication, but her demands had left the staff on edge. Gretchen! Zarah barked from the living room. Gretchen set down the tray she was carrying and hurried to see what the commotion was about. Zarah stood in the center of the room, wearing a sleek red dress that hugged her figure. She was holding a wine glass, which she thrust toward Gretchen. This is dirty, Zarah said, pointing to an invisible speck on the glass. Gretchen inspected the glass and found nothing wrong with it. It looks fine to me, ma'am. It's not fine, Zarah insisted. Get me another one, and make sure it's spotless this time. Gretchen sighed but complied, fetching a new glass and pouring wine into it. As she handed it to Zarah, their boss walked into the room, looking dashing in a tailored suit. His eyes immediately found Gretchen. Everything ready? He asked. Yes, sir, Gretchen replied, avoiding his gaze. Zarah looped her arm through his. Of course, everything is ready. I'm maid. Sure of it. Gretchen fought the urge to roll her eyes. As Zarah turned to flaunt her dress, her elbow bumped into Gretchen, sending the wine glass tumbling out of her hand. The red liquid splashed all over Zarah's pristine dress. A collective gasp filled the room. You idiot, Zarah screeched, her face turning redder than her dress. You ruined everything. Gretchen froze for a moment before snapping out of it. I'm so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident. An accident? Zarah snarled. Do you know how much this dress costs? Before Gretchen could respond, her boss stepped between them. Calm down, Zarah, he said firmly. It's just a dress. Go upstairs and change. But? No buts, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Zarah huffed and stormed off, leaving Gretchen and her boss alone. Thank you, sir, Gretchen said quietly. He gave her a small smile. Don't let her get to you. She'll get over it. Gretchen nodded, feeling a strange warmth in her chest at his words. That evening, after the guests had left and the house had quieted down, Gretchen found herself in the kitchen cleaning up. The rain outside had turned into a full-blown storm, with thunder rumbling in the distance. As she scrubbed a stubborn stain on a plate, the kitchen door creaked open. She looked up to see her boss standing there, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. Sir, do you need something? She asked, startled by his unexpected appearance. He stepped inside, leaning against the counter. Just needed some peace and quiet. Gretchen chuckled. You came to the wrong place then. I'm about to start the dishwasher. He smiled, a rare and genuine expression that made her heart skip a beat. I don't mind. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the only sound the rain pounding against the windows. Gretchen, he said suddenly, his tone serious. She looked up, meeting his intense gaze. Yes, sir. I appreciate everything you do around here, he said. I know Zarah can be difficult, but you handle her better than anyone else. Gretchen was taken aback by his words. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. He nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Gretchen couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, something that made her chest tighten and her thoughts race. The next morning, Gretchen was back in the kitchen, meticulously preparing breakfast. Despite the lingering warmth she felt after her boss's kind words the night before, she was bracing herself for another encounter with Zarah. Her instincts were correct because, Moments later, Zarah stormed into the kitchen. "What is this?" Zarah demanded, holding up a plate of toast and bacon. Gretchen glanced at the plate. "Breakfast, ma'am. That's what you asked for last night." Zarah scoffed, placing the plate down forcefully on the counter. "This isn't what I want today. I'm craving an omelet with smoked salmon. Why didn't you read my mind, huh?" Gretchen clenched her jaw but maintained her composure. "I'll prepare it now, ma'am." "You better. And don't keep me waiting," Zarah snapped before flouncing out of the kitchen. Aldrin, who had just entered the kitchen with a cup of coffee in hand, shook his head. "You have the patience of a saint, Gretchen. I don't know how you put up with her." "She's not worth losing my job over," Gretchen replied, cracking eggs into a bowl. "But I swear, one more tantrum, and I might just lose my cool." Aldrin chuckled, leaning against the counter. "You know, I'm betting on you. If anyone can put her in her place, it's you." Gretchen smirked. "Don't tempt me." Later that day, Zarah decided to hold court in the living room, summoning the household staff to discuss her upcoming charity gala. Gretchen and Aldrin exchanged skeptical glances as they stood at the back of the room, listening to Zarah's lofty plans. "This gala needs to be perfect," Zarah declared, her voice dripping with self-importance. "I want every guest to leave thinking I'm the epitome of class and elegance." "Maybe they'll leave thinking your face is the epitome of flour," Gretchen muttered under her breath. Aldrin snorted, quickly covering his mouth to stifle his laughter. Zarah glared in their direction. "Something funny?" she demanded. "Not at all, ma'am," Gretchen replied innocently, her eyes wide with feigned sincerity. Zarah narrowed her eyes but let it go, continuing her speech. "I'll need everyone to be on their best behavior. That includes you, Gretchen. No attitude, no backtalk, and definitely no accidents." "Yes, ma'am," Gretchen said sweetly, though her clenched fists betrayed her frustration. As the meeting dragged on, Gretchen found herself distracted by her boss, who was seated on the other side of the room. His sharp gaze followed the exchange between Gretchen and Zarah, and though he didn't intervene, the faint smirk on his lips told Gretchen he was amused. After the meeting, Gretchen approached him as the staff dispersed. "Sir, may I have a word?" He looked up, surprised by her directness. "Of course, Gretchen. What's on your mind?" "It's about Zarah," she began, lowering her voice. "I know she's your girlfriend, but the way she treats the staff, it's not right. I don't mean to overstep, but—" "You're not overstepping," he interrupted, his tone firm but understanding. "I've noticed it too. I'll talk to her, but you know how stubborn she can be. In the meantime, just try to be patient." Gretchen sighed, nodding. "Thank you, sir. That's all I ask." As she turned to leave, he called after her. "And Gretchen?" "Yes, sir." "Don't let her dim your spark. You're stronger than you realize." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, and she left the room with a faint smile, feeling a flicker of hope. That evening, as rain drummed against the windows, Gretchen found herself in the library organizing books. It was one of the few places in the house where she could find peace. She was reaching for a high shelf when the door creaked open. "Gretchen," her boss's familiar baritone voice called out. She turned, startled. "Sir, do you need something?" He stepped into the room, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. "I was looking for a quiet place to think. Didn't expect to find you here." "This is my escape," she admitted, gesturing to the rows of books. "What about you? Escaping Zarah's latest drama?" He chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Something like that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the rain providing a soothing backdrop. "Gretchen," he said suddenly, his voice softer now. She turned to face him, surprised by the vulnerability in his expression. "I want to apologize for Zarah's behavior," he said. "She can be difficult, but that's no excuse for the way she's treated you." Gretchen blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." "I mean it," he continued, stepping closer. You've been nothing but patient and professional, and I admire that about you. You don't let anyone walk all over you, not even her." Her cheeks flushed at his words. "I just do what I think is right." "And that's what makes you different," he said, his gaze intense. For a moment, they were both silent, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Gretchen's heart raced as she searched his face, wondering if she was imagining the way his eyes lingered on hers. Finally, he stepped back, the moment broken. "I should go. Thank you for letting me interrupt your peace." "Anytime, sir," she said softly, watching as he left the room. As the door closed behind him, Gretchen sank into a nearby chair, her mind racing. What just happened? She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid thud of her heart. Whatever it was, she couldn't deny that something between them was beginning to shift. The following morning, Gretchen woke up earlier than usual. She had been restless the previous night, her thoughts consumed by the strange, yet thrilling conversation with her boss in the library. She wasn't sure what had shifted between them, but it left her feeling unsettled and curious. She decided to focus her energy on the day's tasks, starting with a thorough cleaning of the kitchen. As she scrubbed the countertops, Aldrin appeared, a mischievous grin on his face. "Good morning, Gretchen," he greeted, plopping onto one of the stools. "Morning," she replied, not looking up from her work. "You seem distracted," Aldrin teased, leaning forward. "What's on your mind? Or should I say, who's on your mind?" Gretchen shot him a sharp look. "Don't start, Aldrin." He chuckled, holding up his hands in surrender. "I'm just saying, you've been unusually quiet today, and last night, I saw Sir coming out of the library looking like he just had an epiphany. Care to explain?" "There's nothing to explain," Gretchen said quickly, though the blush rising in her cheeks betrayed her. Aldrin smirked. "If you say so, but just a warning. People are starting to notice how Sir looks at you. Even Zarah." At the mention of Zarah's name, Gretchen froze. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say she's not blind, and if you're not careful, her claws might come out." Gretchen frowned, feeling a pang of unease. She had no interest in provoking Zarah's wrath, but she also couldn't deny the growing connection between her and her boss. Later that day, Gretchen was in the kitchen preparing dessert for lunch. She had decided to make a classic mango float, knowing it was one of her boss's favorites. As she worked, Zarah sauntered in, her heels clicking loudly against the tiled floor. "Gretchen," Zarah said, her tone sharp. "Yes, ma'am," Gretchen replied, keeping her voice polite. "What are you making?" "Mango float, ma'am." Zarah wrinkled her nose. "That's too simple. Don't you know how to make anything more sophisticated?" Gretchen bit back a retort, focusing on her work. "This is what Sir requested." Zarah's expression darkened at the mention of her boyfriend. Of course, it's what he requested. He always gets what he wants, doesn't he? Before Gretchen could respond, Zarah grabbed a bag of flour from the counter and deliberately spilled some onto the floor. "Oh no," Zarah said mockingly. "How clumsy of me. Gretchen, clean that up, will you?" Gretchen stared at the mess, her hands curling into fists. She knew Zarah had done it on purpose, but she didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Yes, ma'am," Gretchen said through gritted teeth, grabbing a broom. As she cleaned, Zarah smirked, clearly enjoying the sight of Gretchen on her knees. But just as Zarah was about to leave, her heel caught on the spilled flour and she slipped, landing ungracefully on the floor. Gretchen couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. "Are you laughing at me?" Zarah shrieked, struggling to get up. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Gretchen said, trying and failing to suppress her laughter. "But you have to admit, that was pretty funny." Zarah glared at her, her face red with humiliation. "You'll regret this, Gretchen," she hissed before storming out of the kitchen. That evening, Gretchen decided to take a walk in the garden to clear her mind. The events of the day had left her feeling drained, and she needed some fresh air. As she wandered among the flowers, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw her boss approaching, his expression unreadable. "Sir," she said, startled, "what are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, stopping a few feet away from her. "I heard about what happened with Zarah in the kitchen." Gretchen tensed, unsure of what to say. "It wasn't my fault, sir." "I know," he interrupted, his voice calm. "I know what she's like. You don't have to explain yourself to me." She relaxed slightly, surprised by his understanding. "Thank you, sir." They stood in silence for a moment, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves around them. "Gretchen," he said suddenly, his tone serious, "I want you to know that I appreciate everything you do. You're not just a maid in this house, you're someone I trust, and I don't want you to feel like you have to put up with Zarah's behavior." Her breath caught at his words. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, stepping closer. "Just know that I'm here if you need anything." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away. Gretchen's heart pounded as she struggled to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. Finally, he broke the silence. "It's getting late. You should head inside." "Yes, sir," she said softly, watching as he walked away. As she returned to the house, Gretchen couldn't help but replay his words in her mind. Trust, appreciation. It was more than she had ever expected to hear from him, and it left her feeling both hopeful and terrified. The next morning, Gretchen woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She reminded herself that she had survived worse than dealing with Zarah's petty antics, and she wasn't about to let anyone drive her out of the mansion. In the kitchen, Gretchen was busy preparing breakfast when Aldrin entered, his expression as curious as ever. "You look like you're planning something," he teased, leaning against the counter. "Planning to survive another day with Zarah's dramatics, you mean?" Gretchen quipped, smirking. Aldrin chuckled. "She does seem determined to get under your skin, but you're tougher than her, Gretchen. I wouldn't worry too much." "I'm not worried," Gretchen replied confidently. "I'm just annoyed." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of heels clicking on the floor. Zarah appeared in the doorway, her face set in a scowl. "Gretchen," she snapped, ignoring Aldrin completely, "I need my breakfast in my room. Now." Gretchen arched an eyebrow. "Ma'am, breakfast is served in the dining room. If you want to eat in your room, you'll have to take it yourself." Zarah's jaw dropped, and for a moment, she looked like she was about to explode. "How dare you?" Before she could finish, Gretchen's boss walked in, his presence commanding the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes moving between Gretchen and Zarah. "Your maid is being disrespectful," Zarah exclaimed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Gretchen. Gretchen opened her mouth to defend herself, but her boss raised a hand, silencing her. "Zarah, if you're going to accuse someone, make sure it's warranted. Gretchen is one of the hardest working people in this house, and I trust her judgment." Zarah looked stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "But—" "No buts," he said firmly. "If you want breakfast in your room, take it yourself." Gretchen bit back a smile as Zarah huffed and stormed out of the kitchen, muttering under her breath. Aldrin snickered once she was gone. "Looks like Sir has your back, Gretchen." Gretchen glanced at her boss, who was now pouring himself a cup of coffee. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his gaze, something warm and protective. That afternoon, Gretchen decided to take a break and explore the garden. It had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could clear her mind and find peace. She was admiring the blooming roses when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw her boss approaching, his hands in his pockets. "Sir," she said, surprised, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I needed some fresh air," he replied, stopping a few feet away from her. "And I thought I might find you here." Gretchen's heart skipped a beat. "Is there something you need?" He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, I just wanted to talk." They walked together through the garden, the conversation flowing more easily than Gretchen had expected. They talked about everything: her childhood, his travels, and even their favorite foods. For the first time, Gretchen saw a softer side of him, one that was rarely visible behind his stern exterior. She found herself laughing at his stories, and he seemed to enjoy her company just as much. As the sun began to set, they stopped by a bench near the fountain. "Gretchen," he said, his tone serious, "I know you've been dealing with a lot lately, especially with Zarah. I want you to know that I appreciate everything you do for this household. You're more than just a maid to me." Her breath caught at his words. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, her cheeks flushing. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away. Gretchen's heart pounded as she struggled to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. That evening, the household was buzzing with activity. A dinner party had been planned, and the guests were starting to arrive. Gretchen was in the kitchen, overseeing the final preparations, when Aldrin came rushing in. "You're not going to believe this," he said, breathless. "What now?" Gretchen asked, already bracing herself for more drama. "Zarah just told the guests that she's the one who planned the entire menu," Aldrin said, his eyes wide with disbelief. Gretchen rolled her eyes. "Of course she did." "You're not going to let her get away with that, are you?" Aldrin asked. Gretchen smirked. "Don't worry, I have a plan." As the guests gathered in the dining room, Gretchen discreetly approached her boss, who was seated at the head of the table. "Sir," she whispered, leaning close, "can I have a word with you?" He nodded, excusing himself from the table. "What is it, Gretchen?" he asked once they were alone. "Zarah is taking credit for the menu," she said bluntly. "I just thought you should know." His expression darkened. "I'll handle it." When they returned to the dining room, he stood and tapped his glass, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone very important to this evening's success. The menu you're enjoying tonight was not planned by Zarah, as she claimed, but by our talented chef, Gretchen." The room erupted into applause, and Gretchen felt her cheeks flush with both embarrassment and pride. Zarah, meanwhile, looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. As the evening went on, Gretchen couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had faced countless challenges since working in the mansion, but tonight, she had won a small but significant victory. And as she caught her boss's gaze across the room, she realized that she wasn't alone in her struggles. He was on her side, and that made all the difference. The morning after the dinner party, Gretchen busied herself in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared breakfast. The events of the previous night still lingered in her mind. The applause from the guests, Zarah's mortified expression, and most of all, the approving look from her boss. It was a small victory, but one that fueled her confidence. Aldrin entered the kitchen, his face lit with mischief. "You were the talk of the party last night, Gretchen. Everyone couldn't stop praising your cooking. Even my aunt asked if you had a restaurant." Gretchen smirked, trying to play it cool. "Well, I don't mean to brag, but I do know my way around a kitchen." Their laughter was interrupted by a sudden presence at the doorway. It was her boss, his expression unreadable as he leaned against the frame. "Gretchen," he said, his voice low and commanding, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Gretchen blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, of course, sir." She followed him out of the kitchen and into the garden, where the morning sun bathed everything in a golden glow. He stopped near the fountain, turning to face her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You handled yourself well last night," he began, his tone softer now. "I know Zarah can be difficult, but you stood your ground. I respect that." Gretchen felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing what I thought was right." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "You're different, Gretchen. You're not afraid to speak your mind, even when it's not easy. It's refreshing." For a moment, they stood in silence, the sound of the fountain filling the air. Gretchen's cheeks flushed as she tried to process his words. Was this a compliment, Or was there something deeper behind it? Before she could respond, he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this house. If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, just come to me. Her breath hitched at his proximity. Thank you, sir, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, Gretchen felt her heart pounding in her chest. What was happening between them? Later that day, Zarah was on a rampage. The humiliation she had faced at the dinner party had clearly not been forgotten. She stormed into the kitchen, her face set in a scowl. Gretchen, she snapped, where's my lunch? Do I have to wait all day for it? Gretchen didn't even look up from the pot she was stirring. Your lunch is on the counter. Feel free to take it to the dining room yourself. Zarah's jaw dropped. You're the maid. You're supposed to serve me. Gretchen finally turned to face her, a smirk playing on her lips. Actually, I'm the cook. My job is to prepare the food, not deliver it. If you're hungry, you know where the dining room is. Aldrin, who had been watching from the corner, burst out laughing. She's got a point, you know. Zarah shot him a glare before turning back to Gretchen. You think you're so clever, don't you? Gretchen shrugged. Not clever, just honest. Before Zarah could respond, their boss entered the kitchen, his presence immediately silencing the room. What's going on here? He asked, his gaze shifting between Gretchen and Zarah. Zarah plastered on a fake smile. Nothing, Han. Just a little misunderstanding. Gretchen rolled her eyes but said nothing. She had learned by now that arguing with Zarah in front of him was pointless. Good, he said, his tone firm, because I don't want any more drama in this house. As he left, Zarah shot Gretchen a venomous look before stalking out of the kitchen. Aldrin grinned at Gretchen. You're fearless, you know that? Gretchen laughed. Someone has to put her in her place. That evening, the household was unusually quiet. The guests had left, and Zarah had retreated to her room, sulking. Gretchen decided to take advantage of the peace and headed out to the garden. She was admiring the night sky when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw her boss approaching, his hands in his pockets. Couldn't sleep? He asked, stopping a few feet away. Gretchen shrugged. Just needed some fresh air. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the stars. It's a beautiful night. They stood in silence for a moment, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. Then, to her surprise, he extended a hand toward her. Dance with me, he said, his voice soft. Gretchen blinked, caught off guard. What? Dance with me, he repeated, a small smile playing on his lips. She hesitated for a moment before placing her hand in his. He pulled her close, and they began to sway to the sound of the crickets and the gentle rustle of the wind. Gretchen's heart raced as she felt his hand on her waist, his touch both firm and gentle. She had never imagined herself in this position, dancing with her boss under the stars. You're full of surprises, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. So are you, he replied, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in their own little bubble. Gretchen's mind raced with questions, but in that moment, none of them seemed to matter. As the dance came to an end, he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. Good night, Gretchen. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the garden with her heart pounding and her mind spinning. The household buzzed with quiet tension the morning after the unexpected dance in the garden. Gretchen woke up still replaying the memory of his hand on her waist and the way his voice softened when he whispered good night. But those thoughts were quickly dashed when Zarah stormed into the kitchen mid-breakfast preparations, her face twisted with fury. What's this I hear about you dancing with my boyfriend? Zarah demanded, her voice loud enough to make Aldrin, who was munching on pandesal, choke on his coffee. Gretchen, busy plating a stack of pancakes, raised an unimpressed eyebrow. Excuse me? Your boyfriend asked me for a dance under the stars. It's not like I forced him, flower face. Zarah's eyes narrowed. You're crossing a line, maid. Aldrin coughed into his hand to stifle a laugh, while Gretchen turned to fully face Zarah, hands on her hips. Maid or not, I don't take orders from you. And since we're being honest, maybe your boyfriend wouldn't be asking me for dances if you weren't too busy acting like a spoiled brat. Zarah gasped, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a way. Before she could retort, their boss entered the kitchen, his sharp gaze darting between the two women. What's going on here? He asked, his tone cold enough to make Zarah flinch. Han, she's being disrespectful again, Zarah whined, pointing a manicured finger at Gretchen. But instead of reprimanding Gretchen, he sighed in frustration. Zarah, I told you to stop causing unnecessary drama. This is a household, not a soap opera. Zarah's jaw dropped. You're defending her? I'm asking you to behave, he replied firmly. Then, turning to Gretchen, his gaze softened slightly. Gretchen, can I speak with you privately? Gretchen's stomach twisted at the request, but she nodded, following him out to the veranda. The fresh air was a welcome change from the stifling tension in the kitchen. I'm sorry about Zarah, he began, leaning against the railing. She can be difficult. Gretchen crossed her arms. With all due respect, sir, maybe you should ask yourself why you're with someone like that in the first place. Her boss chuckled, the sound low and warm. You're not afraid to speak your mind, are you? No point in sugarcoating the truth, Gretchen replied with a shrug. He regarded her for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That's what I like about you, Gretchen. You're honest, even when it's inconvenient. Her heart skipped a beat at his words, but she quickly masked her reaction with a light laugh. Well, someone has to keep things real around here. Later that evening, the household was thrown into chaos when an unexpected visitor arrived, Zarah's mother. The woman was as dramatic as her daughter, sweeping into the house in a cloud of expensive perfume and designer fabrics. Where is my darling Zarah? She demanded, ignoring the staff scrambling to assist her with her luggage. Zarah rushed to greet her mother, throwing her arms around her. Mommy, what are you doing here? I came to check on you, of course, and to meet this man you keep talking about, her mother said, her eyes scanning the room. When her gaze landed on Gretchen, who was setting the dining table, her lips curled in disdain. And who is this? I'm Gretchen, the cook, Gretchen replied, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. The woman sniffed, clearly unimpressed. Well, I hope the food is edible. Gretchen resisted the urge to roll her eyes. I'll let the food speak for itself. Dinner was a tense affair. Zarah's mother spent most of the meal criticizing the decor, the menu, and even the way the staff served the dishes. Gretchen bit her tongue, focusing on keeping her composure as she served the main course. But things took a turn when Zarah's mother decided to comment on her daughter's relationship. Darling, are you sure this man is serious about you? She asked Zarah, loud enough for everyone to hear. He seems rather distracted. Zarah flushed, her eyes darting to her boyfriend, who was calmly sipping his wine. Gretchen, standing near the kitchen door, caught the subtle smirk playing on his lips and couldn't help but stifle a laugh. The day after the disastrous dinner, the household was still reeling from Zarah's mother's visit. Gretchen decided to take some time to herself, heading to the unused piano in the sitting room. She had always loved playing the piano, but it wasn't something she advertised. It was one of the few things that reminded her of her late mother, who had taught her to play when she was a child. As her fingers danced across the keys, the familiar melody of Clair de Lune filled the room. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the music. Unbeknownst to her, her boss had entered the room, drawn by the sound of the piano. He stood silently by the doorway, watching her with an expression of quiet admiration. When the song ended, Gretchen opened her eyes and nearly jumped out of her seat when she saw him standing there. Sir, I didn't see you there, she stammered, her cheeks flushing. You play beautifully, he said, stepping into the room. Why didn't you tell me you could play? It's just a hobby, she replied, looking down at the keys. "Well, it's a hobby you're very good at," he said, sitting down beside her on the bench. For a moment, they sat in silence, the proximity making Gretchen's heart race. Then, he reached out and placed his hand over hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Gretchen," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something about you that I can't ignore." Her breath caught in her throat. Was he finally admitting what she had suspected all along? Before she could respond, the sound of Zarah's voice echoed down the hallway, breaking the moment. "Where are you, Han?" Her boss sighed, pulling his hand away. "We'll talk later," he said, standing up and walking out of the room. As Gretchen sat there alone, her mind raced with questions. What had he been about to say? And what did it mean for the complicated dynamic between them? The days following the dinner with Zarah's mother were tense. Gretchen found herself on edge, her mind constantly replaying the moments with her boss. The way he looked at her, the warmth in his voice. It was dangerous territory for her, one where emotions could cloud her judgment. One afternoon, as she was preparing desserts for tea, Aldrin approached her quietly, his expression thoughtful. "Gretchen," he began, his voice low, "there's something you should know." Gretchen paused, setting down a tray of pastries. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Sir has been acting different, not just around you, but with everyone. He's quieter, more introspective." Gretchen raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's my fault?" "No," Aldrin said quickly. "It's not like that. It's just, I've never seen him like this before." Gretchen couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Was it possible her growing feelings for her boss were influencing how he acted? She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. "Look," Aldrin said, leaning in, "be careful. Zarah's not going to make things easy for you." "I'm used to people like her," Gretchen said with a shrug. "Besides, what can she do that she hasn't already tried?" Aldrin sighed. "Just, don't let your guard down. He's a good man, but even good men have their weaknesses." Later that evening, the household was unusually quiet. Gretchen moved about the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. The tension that had lingered for days seemed to settle into a heavy silence, a palpable force that made her skin crawl. She was almost finished with the meal when she heard the faint sound of piano music drifting from the sitting room. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling slightly as she set down the serving plates. Her boss sat at the piano, his fingers gracefully moving over the keys. The melody was soft, haunting even, and Gretchen found herself mesmerized by the sight. After a few moments, he paused, his gaze turning toward her. "You're still here?" he asked, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I could say the same to you," she replied, stepping closer. He motioned for her to sit beside him. "Stay, just for a little while." Gretchen hesitated, but his quiet intensity made it hard to resist. She lowered herself onto the bench beside him, their shoulders nearly brushing against each other. "You don't know how long I've wanted to talk to you like this," he said softly, the music continuing in the background. Gretchen's heart pounded in her chest. "You should talk to Zarah instead," she said jokingly, though her voice betrayed her nerves. His hand rested lightly on hers, grounding her in the moment. "She's not the one I want to talk to." The air between them thickened, every unspoken word hanging heavy. "I've been thinking a lot," he confessed, "about what you said the other day, about my taste in women." Gretchen bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. "I'm not saying I agree with you," he continued, "but it's made me reflect. I don't want you to think you're just another maid in my house. You're more than that to me." Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't process the words fast enough. "What are you saying?" He turned to her fully, his dark eyes searching hers. "I'm saying, I don't know where this will lead, but I want to explore it. Explore us." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. "You don't have to say things just because." "I'm not saying them because I feel guilty," he interrupted, his voice steady. I'm saying them because I've come to realize I don't want to deny what we have." For a moment, there was only silence between them, save for the gentle piano music in the background. Gretchen felt a surge of emotions she had long kept bottled up, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel. The following morning, Gretchen woke up with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. The weight of the previous days lifted ever so slightly, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Yet, the house was alive with tension once again. Zarah stormed into the dining room, her eyes blazing with fury. "You can't have him," she spat, glaring at Gretchen as she took her seat. "He belongs to me." Gretchen simply raised an eyebrow and poured herself a cup of coffee. "Belongs?" she echoed. "I'm not some object to be owned, Zarah." Their boss entered moments later, his presence immediately commanding attention. He exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with Gretchen before settling into his seat at the head of the table. Zarah wasn't ready to back down. "You don't get to play house with him," she continued, her voice sharp. "He's mine." Her boss finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Enough, Zarah." Zarah's eyes widened in shock. "You're choosing her over me?" "I'm not choosing anyone," he said quietly, "but I won't allow you to dictate how I live my life." The room fell into a tense silence once again. Gretchen's heart thumped in her chest as the truth settled in. Their dynamic was far from simple, but it was real, a complicated, messy reality neither of them could escape. As the morning sun filtered through the windows, Gretchen felt the weight of their future hanging delicately in the balance. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.